Howdy, folks. I am your host, the Mighty Bjorn, and today I'm with you with another video. Going to be doing some Dungeons and Dragons stuff here today, or at least that's what I'm going to be discussing. And this is primarily going to be discussing Dungeons and Dragons. Now, understand, I am discussing this from the standpoint of playing Dungeons and Dragons 3.5, but this might be useful information for those who play fourth edition or fifth edition, or even any edition that follows. Is actually Wizards of the Coast has just actually revealed their new player's handbook, or at least started giving out previews of their new player's handbook. So let's dive into it because today I'm going to be discussing goblins. Now, understand, folks, Dungeons and Dragons and Goblins is as old as, well, Dungeons and Dragons. They've pretty much been there forever as a baseline enemy that is generally easy to kill for low level players. Um, but with that being said, I feel they should definitely be more of a threat than they really are, and there's definitely ways that you can make them more of a threat than they really are. Especially because they're going to be pretty cunning, and they're also going to have massive numbers. They're always depicted as having massive numbers, but yet you very rarely see those mass numbers come to bear in relation to Dungeons and Dragons, and that's because most parties are running into a raiding party or a scouting party, something along those lines. And realistically, they have to be more cunning, especially because they live in a world with orcs and drow and other creatures that are extremely, dangerous to them, because essentially they are the weakest enemy next to the kobold. But yet, with all that being said, they seem to continue to survive and thrive, especially in the kind of climate I am discussing. So there's a lot of things that you could do to kind of spice up your goblins. And realistically, they're all easy things that you can do to spice up your goblins. One easy way to go about this is to adjust their weapons. Now, with the Monster Manual 3.5, goblins pretty much are armed melee wise, are armed with a shield. I believe it's a small wooden shield and a mace. Well, why not swap that out with a short sword? But they actually used to have short swords back in the AD&D days. Or what about just dropping the melee weapon in the shield for a spear? That would be another common weapon I feel that goblins would have. They would have weapons that essentially are more or less regional, because they are pretty heavily reliant on raiding. That being said, they should also be able to make their own weapons, even if they're primitive. And their raiding parties should definitely affect that. So that's a good way to kind of spice up the goblins, by having different types of weapons within the raiding party, and even different types of armor, shields, and etc. And also ranged weapons. In D&D 3.5, they're depicted as having javelins. I believe with Advanced Dungeons Dragons, it was short bows. I tend to do a combination of javelins, short bows, sometimes, very rarely, light crossbows, and slings, with the more common actually being slings and short bows, even more so than javelins, because javelins are heavily reliant on kind of having a higher strength than higher dexterity. So by using bows, it kind of plays a little bit more in favor for the goblins themselves, and makes them a little bit more dangerous at a range. And with that being said, they should have a pretty good combination of melee and ranged weapons within their raiding parties in general. They should have a wide variety of equipment. And your raiding parties should be a dozen, if not more. They should, generally speaking, especially when you start getting to your mid-level PCs, they should have a 2 to 3 to 1 advantage. That's probably about the only time they're ever going to attack, which is basically using overwhelming numbers. Now, another thing too you could have is different types of variants. Now, this is from the Monster Manual 4th edition. Now, I believe what you have here is you have a Hexer, a Skull Crusher, and a Warrior. And this is something that you should probably do and use, especially even adjust the levels a little bit higher to make these different types of specialized goblins more of a threat to the players. So that way, when players see goblins, they may automatically assume that, oh, it's goblins, they're pushovers. And then they find out, well, maybe they're not pushovers after all. And realistically, like I said a bit ago, goblins really shouldn't be pushovers. And generally, maybe they should be, but yeah, they're going to have their own elite warriors for sure. And then, of course, you could also have goblin assassins, which could be an interesting twist on things. A well-equipped, a well-equipped assassin that's a goblin, and maybe even a local goblin king put a bounty out on the players. So that could be an interesting thing that you could do within your Dungeons and Dragons campaign itself. Another thing that's as old as the hills is goblins and wargs. Goblins like to use wargs as cavalry, essentially, as horses. And it makes for a pretty lethal cavalry force. And this is another thing that you'd have within raiding parties where you may have a dozen or 20 goblins riding around on wargs, creating all kinds of havoc and raiding supply chains and things of that nature. That's what they're primarily going to do. Pretty much whatever they can't make, they're going to steal or fight for to the death. Now, another thing you could do to also spice this up, even because at this point everybody's used to the idea of goblins riding wargs, is have goblins riding boars, or even some type of dire boar or something along those lines. Actually, a dire boar, I do believe in the 3.5 monster manual, is more dangerous than a warg. So it could be interesting to see or to use dire boars. It could increase the threat level of the goblins themselves. Another thing that probably should be thought about even is, sorry about that, I'm old and shit, is overwhelming numbers. You should definitely, and this is something that you can maybe make a house rule on, is just overwhelming numbers, because it doesn't matter if it's Achilles himself. With enough people trying to kill that one person, they're going to overwhelm that person sooner or later. As you can see here, you have a massive group of goblins essentially overwhelming a knight and his steed. So, yeah, goblins can be pretty damn dangerous in massive numbers if you bring those massive numbers to bear. Now, in my world, there is gunpowder weapons, and this is something I do directly for my world, is there actually is a goblin mercenary unit that fights as an organized military using hand cannons, essentially very early gunpowder weapons. And these are gunpowder weapons that essentially they've, stolen. They craft their own ammo, and actually, in lore, my lore, they actually have a way to get gunpowder because of living underground. They know the mixture of sulfur and saltpeter and things of that nature to make gunpowder, even though it's a very rudimentary, very low grade gunpowder compared to what the rest of the world is using, but it's still gunpowder nonetheless. And essentially, they use very early shot and pike tactics. Now it's more of spear and shot tactics, but they still work, and they're actually quite lethal. And I actually adjust their level a little bit higher. They're more of on the level with hobgoblins and things of that nature, so they're easy to kill, but they're not as easy to kill. And because they actually fight as a uniformed unit, they're actually quite dangerous. And essentially, they just have essentially mimicked what humans and the other races are doing over time. So that could be an interesting thing you can implement in your world, is a mercenary force of goblins that is actually a threat to the players themselves, which would make your goblins more interesting and more spicy, and maybe also put them at a standpoint where they're not such pushovers. But anyway, folks, that's my thoughts today on goblins and just some idea of what you can do to spice things up when it comes to your goblins and your Dungeons and Dragons campaign. Hopefully, you all enjoyed the video. Thank you very much for tuning in, and have yourself a wonderful day.